Hello, everyone, and welcome to session number 3 out of our 4 sessions about the book Psychedelic Outlaws. We're going to wait 2 minutes to allow more people to join, and then we will get started. I hope those of you who are joining us have received the copy of the book and that you are making good progress and enjoying it. Excellent. Yeah, exactly. It always blurs, and it's like, I believe it's the right book, though. I know I am making very good progress at the final chapter, and what a great read it has been. So again, Joanna, just really well done. And yeah, and it covers a lot of ground, and it does so in a way that is deeply informed and fact-based, but also interesting and narrative and engaging and learning about the individuals involved. So just really well done. And I will encourage everyone, if you have not yet, please consider giving it a review and stars on platforms where you buy books. Ask your local libraries if they have it, and if not, if they can order it, talk it up with your friends and family. We want to get this book out there, find its audience, and get more people to know about the journey of people with cluster headache and developing this medicine. Okay, and we'll go ahead and jump into it so we can get to it. So my name is Kevin Lenneberg. I am the policy director for Clusterbusters. I am your host this evening. Eileen Brewer will be back next week for our 4th and final session. I am thrilled to be joined today with the author, the amazing Joanna Kempner. We have Bob Wold, who is the founder and executive director of Clusterbusters. We have Marsha Weil, who is an original board member of Clusterbusters, and she herself lived with cluster headaches for many years, and she led some early projects with research in this space. And then we have Luke Richert, who is a professor of pharmacy history at UW-Madison, where he also teaches and writes about substances, intoxicants, drugs, and regulation. He is the executive director of the American Institute for the History of Pharmacy, and he is an advisor to Porta Sophia, which is heavily involved in patents and looking at that in relation to psychedelics. So there is a lot that is going to be covered in today's session. The book covered a lot about what it takes to try to make a psychedelic into something that is a medicine, and what a long journey with so many twists and turns. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to author Joanna Kempner, who is going to go ahead and start with a reading from the book.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. This is the section of the book where the story goes really wild. And before I start the reading, I wanted to just talk for a minute or two about why I call this section of this book Psychedelic Citizenship. So psychedelic citizenship is kind of a riff on a concept in social sciences called biological citizenship. And this is biological citizenship is this idea that people and groups want to claim when they claim rights and responsibilities based on their health conditions, or on their illness or their disease. So you can think, a classic example of just claiming disability, right? So and when people organize around a shared health issue, they advocate for recognition, support, and resources from state and institutions. In this case, Clusterbusters decides to go to try and find scientists who can help them bring this psychedelic protocol they've developed through to medicine, right? Because they want to reach more people. Biological citizenship is really empowering. It's collaborative, and it's a way for people to advocate for policies that direct resources to their disease. It helps build community for people who are sick. And it raises ethical questions about how societies differently value different people based on the kinds of disabilities and the kind of different health problems that they have. And so when I was writing this section, and you see Clusterbusters really reach out to different kinds of doctors and different kinds of scientists for help, you see a lot of this play out in ways that are kind of surprising in some, in some cases, especially if you think that medicine is a place where you go for help. And you see a lot of the real challenges of especially like that kind of early stage in the second wave of psychedelic research. So that's just kind of the part of the book we're in. And the reading that I'm going to do today is from chapter 14, and it's where I describe what how I envision the above ground of psychedelic science operating with the underground of psychedelic science. And this is on page 247. So the system is a network, and by system, I mean the medical system here, is a network that connects those with credentials with both the underground and indigenous cultures. When restrictive regulations on psychedelic science force above ground scientists to rely on underground knowledge, there is at some point no above ground or underground. There is only dirt. The connections between the two cannot be so easily disentangled. Rick Doblin, and just as a reminder, Rick Doblin is the founder and until recently the executive director of MAPS. I think he has a different position now. So Rick Doblin's success has relied on his ability to navigate this network, strengthening his ties between underground and above ground research. But the pressure of appearing objective all too often encourages scientists to present their research, the fruit of this work, as though it came from nowhere. Doing so runs the risk of biopiracy, the exploitation of knowledge and resources from those with less power. Indigenous communities have long faced the exploitation of their knowledge and resources. And now, as we broaden our perspective, we must also recognize and guard against similar thefts from underground patient communities and citizen scientists. Initiatives that promote respectful collaboration and equitable benefit sharing among all parties, researchers, companies, community groups, indigenous communities, and citizen scientists could be a key in addressing and alleviating these multifaceted tensions. Obscuring outlaw innovation, however, doesn't make it irrelevant. In the same way that admiring only the mushroom emerging above ground obscures the importance of the tangle threads of mycelium below, we can't allow our admiration for eminent scholars to blind us to their connections to the underground. One simply cannot exist without the other. One can easily observe the irony in valuing the knowledge contributions of those who are above ground more than those working underground, which is to say illegally and without credentials, by attending any Clusterbusters conference. At these events, physicians, residents, and pharmaceutical representatives listen to the passionate testimonies of cluster heads who describe how psychedelic drugs saved them after medicine nearly ruined their lives. I've seen physicians initially skeptical, transformed and transfixed by the experience. A room full of energized, optimistic cluster headache patients is very different from the typical clinical encounter with a single struggling cluster headache patient, which is too often marked by medication failures. And there's so much knowledge here. I've kept the story focused on mushrooms, but there have been a lot of innovations still developed in this patient group, including a vitamin D supplementation protocol under study at the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston. As one pharmaceutical representative in attendance at a conference told me, there's nothing these patients can learn from us. They are the ones at the cutting edge of research. Humility like this is in short supply, but necessary for thriving in this field. So I will turn this over to Joe Moore, and thanks so much for the panel, for being here. I'm so grateful that everybody has come and been so excited about the book, and yeah, I'm excited for the conversation.
Fantastic. Let me just add that Joe Moore is the co-founder and CEO of Psychedelics Today. He is a very prominent podcaster, really wide-ranging, his conversations that he has with people and how he really helps to guide the space and how people think about it and understand it. We're honored to have him participate in this, and also honored that I get to work alongside him in the Psychedelics and Pain Association that he helped to co-found along with Wold and Court Wayne. So with that, I'll let Joe Moore take it away. Thanks all.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Joanna. This is really fun for me. I really, really enjoyed the hell out of your book. It was such a pleasure. Um, and yeah, I'm going to be talking about it for years. So very excited about that and very excited to be here for the book club. So the first question I have here is this. The book tells a really interesting part of the kind of psychedelic history. I don't really love the term Renaissance. It's also not very well known in the narrative, right? We have the normal narrative of, Albert Hoffman, Rick Doblin, Tim Leary. Like we don't know much more. But this is a really important narrative. I remember on the forums years ago seeing all these buzzwords. I'm like, okay, I really want to know all these stories. But you helped quite a bit here. So why is this story and time period so important, and what can it teach us about the contemporary efforts to medicalize psychedelics?
So there's a lot of focus on the first wave of psychedelic research and the kind of rediscovery of that wave, often starting around 2006, which is the year that Michael Pollan kind of marked as the beginning of this kind of next wave of psychedelic research. But there's so much experimentation happening underground, and it really picks up online in Usenet groups and groups like, a website like Arrowwood, Earth and Fire Arrowwood's work is so crucial to understanding what's going on now. Their ability to kind of sift through, collect, curate trip experiences, knowledge and information about psychedelics and psychedelic experiences offers people who are interested in psychedelic science at universities really valuable knowledge and information. Somebody like Rick Doblin, who wanted to bring this science up into universities, and John Halpern talks, he's publishing about this in 2001, the internet and the value of the internet. This is like a gold mine, right? Being able to observe naturalistic data. And it's, psychedelics is it's a little different than regular drug development, right? Because you can't, it's Schedule 1. It's not very easy to administer these drugs in the clinic. But what you can do is you can go online, and you can start asking people about their experiences. And you can just kind of, and you can fundraise right from those groups. And you can really see this process operating in this story. Back in, if anybody was online in those days, the internet was a little smaller, a little easier to comprehend and understand, and the psychedelic space was a little smaller. So you can see kind of all the mechanisms at work building, and you can see sort of how that knowledge is kind of filtering up with the underground and the above ground connecting. Now, the reason why it's so helpful to understand today, we found out in the FDA hearing at AdCom, when suddenly people were like, the trick of science really is to look like it's objective, even though science is clearly not objective. Science is made by humans. It's a human activity, and made by people with all kinds of needs and beliefs, and scientists do their best. They use research methods to make it as objective as possible. But when you look at the end result of science, it looks really clean. And what we saw at that FDA meeting was the veil being ripped off, right? We saw people giving public testimony that actually the drug sponsor was influential, that actually the scientists might have had some relationship with culture. And, if you read this, if you understand this, where psychedelic science came from, you see that there was really no other way for this research to occur, given the restraints, the legal restraints on the science.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, this objectivity thing is so important. That perspective from nowhere that's supposedly real. A nice aspiration, I suppose. But Bob, I'm hoping you can go for it.
Oh, I was
Please.
just going to say, we do all understand this when it comes to pharma companies. Like we do all understand that pharma companies influence the research that comes out. So it shouldn't be that surprising that this is also the case here. Okay, now I'll let go.
Right. Usually goes a lot better for them. Bob, I'm kind of curious if you could tell us a bit about the decision for Clusterbusters to go above ground, and what problem were you trying to solve by engaging with physicians?
Um, yeah, that was a decision that was made fairly early on. As far as problems engaging with physicians, I mean, when I first started writing to physicians and headache specialists, they refused to even answer an email if it had the word psilocybin or LSD in the text of the email. They were just really worried that their name would pop up on some DEA list or something. They were just afraid to even put their name on anything in that discussion. So as we were building our community online, it was growing, but we knew that we were only reaching a small percentage of the people with cluster headaches around the world and in the US. And we started getting a lot of reports from people in the community of why they wouldn't try LSD or psilocybin, even though they were hearing great results and what they were using was not working for them. And they had tried just about everything and nothing worked, but they wouldn't try a psychedelic. Number one, because, I don't know if I hadn't started in on the ground floor on this, I don't know if I would have trusted somebody going by the handle of Pink Floyd telling me on the internet that I should try LSD when I have a cluster headache attack. And most people, probably more than 50%, refused to try anything that wasn't prescribed by their doctor and that they couldn't buy at Walgreens. And that number is probably still pretty close today. People trust their doctors. My generation and the generation before trusted doctors implicitly, wouldn't even change doctors because they didn't want to, embarrass their current doctor by telling them that, they weren't helping. So we knew that for us to get out to everybody in the cluster community, we needed to try to get to market through FDA and available to them from their doctor. So after that decision, it was, how do we do that? Well, we start research. Where would be the best place to start research? And we chose Harvard.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Bob. What a path. And
Yeah.
and I'm excited to get to connect with you, Marsha, today. I read about you in the book for the first time, and thank you. But what motivated you to make such a major financial donation to research on psilocybin and LSD for clusters?
Well, I had been reading along online about all the great results people were having with the psilocybin mushrooms, and I felt like there were so many people that were suffering from these things that probably would never hear about psychedelic mushrooms. I mean, back then, this is like 20 years ago, and internet wasn't as big as it is today. And Bob put out this thing. Well, if we had $50,000, we could run a study. And I thought about it, and I thought, well, I got the resources to be able to do that. And I told Bob, sure, I'm game. I'll do it. Bob didn't understand and that I would actually come up with the money, and I did. And basically my whole thing was to try and get the word out there about this. And we certainly achieved that, although we didn't ever get the study, but anyway, yeah. So that's the story.
If I can
Thank
just,
you.
I'll just jump in just real quick on that. So I had formed Clusterbusters, and I announced to the message board that I was on that we were going to try getting a research study done. And within a couple of days of that, I got an email from Marsha, who I knew had been on the message board, but we hadn't really talked before. And she sent me an email saying that she would fund the study. And at that point, I didn't even have a bank account. So I sent a quick email back, thank you, and I'll get back to you when we, get things rolling here. And she wrote back and she said, I don't think you understand. I will fund the study. I'm thinking, we had been getting some donations from people, but I'm getting $5 and $10 donations from people. So I got an email from somebody telling me that they wanted to help fund the study, and I didn't quite catch the meaning of that first email, and followed up after that. But yeah, it was quite a shock when Marsha presented the funding like that.
Yeah, thanks for adding that in, Bob. Now I'm curious about your first trip to Boston together after you started to connect with John Halpern and Dr. Sewell, and Rick Doblin. What were you guys up to for those 3 days, and what sort of things were you trying to work out?
Who would like to jump in on that one?
And that's to Marsha or Bob, just like a little bit of history, like how are you trying to set up the study, or what kind of stuff did you need to do to set it up, or anything like that?
I think
Bob, you're on mute, actually.
Okay. Did you hear that, Marsha, or do you want me to jump in?
Yeah, go for it. I think
Oh.
I thought you were talking, but
Okay,
I couldn't
no.
hear you.
No, you couldn't because I was on mute. So
Oh,
I'm learning this new thing called Zoom.
okay.
So yeah, we put together a team of 6 of us that went to Boston to meet with Rick Doblin and John Halpern and discuss what it was going to take to put this study together. Who was kind of going to be doing what, how we were going to be supported. We took a lot of data with us that we had collected on surveys in our community, and pretty much spent a lot of time at Rick Doblin's house, meeting his family and staying there, and had a lot of discussions about pulling this research study together. It was something that we all needed to learn about and what it was going to take to do this, how much it was going to cost. The original estimate when I first wrote to Rick was he thought we could do it for $20,000. And after one phone call with John Halpern on the phone, it went up to $50,000. And Marsha met that funding request. And so it was really a learning experience about what we had ahead of us as far as pulling a study together and what it might take to get it approved at Harvard and moving forward. So it was a very interesting time.
I think also at the time after the meeting, Bob and I talked about how all the puzzle pieces were coming together for this study. We were both really excited. It just seemed like it was a great fit. We liked, Andrew was coming on board, a neurologist and a psychiatrist, and he was very excited about our group, and so we were pretty enthusiastic and felt pretty good after that meeting, I thought.
Yeah, I remember that. Us talking about it just seemed like everything was falling in place and people were coming up and joining in, and yeah, we were all pretty excited. So
Yeah. Then
One of the things that I had said early on was because psychedelic research had been shut down for 40 years. So I was like, we need to get this going, and it may take 40 years, so we better get started now because we're 40 years behind. So now 20 some years later, I don't know, maybe I'm only halfway there, but yeah, but that was one of the reasons we felt kind of a need for urgency to get things moving.
And we did initially get a lot of publicity, mainly about psilocybin's coming back to Harvard, that kind of news report. All these years after Timothy Leary, psilocybin's going to come back to Harvard. That was big news. So I felt good about that. And of course, John Halpern loved city. So
Yep.
Right. Yeah, the book captures the story, I think, quite well. A lot of the key elements of this kind of interesting thing, and it got difficult, right? So, Joanna, I'm wondering if you could chime in here, since you know so much about how academic research happens, and a lot of history. And obviously, I've heard that academia can be very difficult to navigate. Part of the reason I'm not there. Um, did what Clusterbusters experience at McLean surprise you, or do you think it was kind of exactly as should be expected?
Well, I think that Marsha and Bob may not have known how vicious and hierarchical academia can be, especially a place like, I think, medical schools in general. And Luke knows more about working in a kind of medical part of the university, where people tend to work on soft money, which means that your salaries, John Halpern, he's a faculty member in Harvard Medical School, but his salary is not guaranteed. And I'm not sure if you guys knew that right off the bat, if you understood that his salary, he had to raise all of his own money, he had to raise all of his own funding for his computer, his pens, everything. Because the arrangement was that Andrew Sewell, who at the time was a postdoc there for somebody else, not working with John Halpern, but was paid for somebody else, was going to be doing this as a volunteer labor in his extra spare time. So you guys were getting labor for free. And John kept wanting you guys to really understand that, how much you were getting for free. And I think you were like, but we just paid you all this money. Right.
Right.
So, and that doesn't necessarily make sense to a normal it's like when I think Luke will understand this, like when we tell people that we publish articles for free, like we don't get paid, and people are, regular people are like, why would you do that? Like the finances, the economics of working in academic careers doesn't map on to like how normal businesses work necessarily. So there was a little bit of that tension right away. And when I met Bob, he was, which was in, we met in 2012, and then I sat down for lunch with you in 2013. You said things were difficult, that you did not know that academic research was going to be so hard. And I was like, yeah, academics can be rough. But when I went in and I saw what really happened, I was like, this is not normal. I mean, I've seen some like really tough fights. I've seen colleagues who don't speak to each other, who won't, just will not even acknowledge each other's presence. That is a pretty regular thing that happens in universities. But I had never seen this level of dysfunction. So yeah, it wasn't normal. It wasn't normal. Part of that, I think, is structural, in the sense that I think that things were really difficult it was really difficult to do psychedelic research at McLean at that time. And I think we all know that people don't behave that well. when they're in difficult work situations. Some of it was even more difficult than that. But I don't know, Luke, if you want to jump in. I don't think you didn't get the full force of the entire reading through the entire many year situation that they went through, but you read the cleaned up version.
Yeah, thanks for queuing me up. I'll just add quickly that the situation hasn't really changed in 2024, 2025, that a lot of universities are still struggling to generate funding streams and revenue streams, and the soft money phenomenon is still present. And so, it's just funny how, decades later, even though we are in this quote unquote Renaissance revival, however you want to put it, that resources are still fairly scarce for basic animal trials and then obviously larger trials too.
Yeah, I think it's really challenging, I think, to understand how somebody who's made it to this faculty position, at Harvard is really trying to eke by day, with something like just their salary, trying to get like the basic resources they need to do research. And for a patient group to walk into that kind of mess, I mean, that really does generate a lot of fights. It generates a lot of fights. And this was a very bad one.
I think it was a lot of it was us just learning as we go. We didn't know a lot of this and how this was all going to work. And, one of the first things we found out was, that Harvard was going to take a percentage of any money that was donated to the research. And, things like that. And it was just like, so, and most of those things were like, oh, okay, so that's the way it is. So it's okay, we'll do this and do that. But there were certainly some surprises along the way that were really like a slap in the face to us, and something that we needed to try to figure out a way to work around and get the work done. And, we had already put a lot of money into it. We hadn't even written the protocol for the study yet. And, we were already being pressured to come up with more funding because more people needed to be involved. And yeah, we knew that Dr. Sewell was donating his time. But even that didn't make him happy when he found out that we had made a $10,000 payment to John Halpern, and Sewell had supposedly done all the work and wasn't offered a cut of that $10,000. It's like, we have no idea what your funding, regimen is on this. Can we just do the work? So there were a lot of things that we learned along the way that were difficult to manage, but a lot of it was just, finding out the next thing we need to do.
So it sounds like it was kind of a really messy scene. Joanna, how did you like jump in and organize this? It sounds like there was so many pieces from so many places.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I sound like I'm being vague. So you can go ahead and ask me more specific questions. It's just, hard to know where to get into it. But John Halpern had this idea that I should read all of their email correspondence to really understand the story of what was happening. He no longer had the correspondence. I would be surprised, when you leave, one of the things people often don't realize is when you leave your employment, you lose your correspondence. And Rick Doblin agreed, and Marsha agreed, everybody, well, except for Dr. Sewell, because he wasn't able to, but agreed to let me read the correspondence as Bob Wold had presented it. And Bob is really good. He really keeps clear records. So he handed over all of these emails, and I had to, emails are a kind of funny archive in a way. because people are responding to things in a kind of like, not in a linear, people are responding to each other and to other people in a kind of funny timeline. They pick up conversations that are really old. They may be having conversations on the phone. So you kind of don't have a complete archive of what's going on. So, there's a lot of fact checking involved. And very often I would think I would know the story, and then I would go back into that set of email correspondence and realize actually there had been a side conversation elsewhere that completely changed everything I knew. The other thing I learned pretty quickly was that most people's memories of what happened wasn't quite right. And that's not surprising. All of us misremember, or, certain certain pieces of our narratives, become more salient than others. We have selective retellings of these stories. So I was able to ask people what had happened, and then I had to kind of like trace back what was going on. So it was a pretty kind of like messy conversation, kind of putting it all together. But it was kind of fascinating to see all of these negotiations. And what you really do see, I'll tell you the kind of observations I had. First of all, Bob starts working on the protocol and collecting data right away, from the minute he starts talking to Rick Doblin. And he is putting in a huge amount of work. That was extremely obvious from the beginning. So a lot of what I'm doing is trying to figure out how much of the research is actually Bob Wold and how much is the people at Harvard. I'm also trying to figure out, so that's part of this kind of like, who deserves credit and who should be an author. That kind of comes up and becomes really confusing. But I am able to trace quite a lot of that because Andrew Sewell is sharing a lot of the data information, and there's a lot kind of quite detailed back and forth. So I was able to piece together who was contributing what and when. And then I was able to kind of see those peer reviews come back, describing what people inside of Harvard thought about that 2006 neurology article. But because that happened so long ago, I am missing information. I don't know who sent those peer reviews. I can't go back and talk to them. So there's like little bits and pieces that are missing. So yeah, so it was a messy situation. What came through loud and clear was that Clusterbusters, and specifically Bob, were doing a huge amount of the research. And then that was being wiped clear of the actual article production. And then after Halperngate, after this kind of, there's a whole kind of unbelievable drama that occurs after we discover that John Halpern has this public accusation made against him, and there is so much negotiation around what's going to happen next. And then you see just a lot. I mean, Bob Wold's email is just pinging all the time with requests, and Marsha's too, with requests for money, just constant demands. I mean, it really, I was pretty kind with how I detail what was going on, but Marsha and Bob were under a lot of pressure after that to kind of keep producing, keep providing resources for John Halpern to maintain his research agenda.
Yeah. People should definitely dig into this story. I've wanted to dig into this story for, I don't know, since I bumped into it on the early internet, 2006, 7-ish. I'm so happy I finally filled in some details, but I don't know if I need to know all that much more. But so, so one of the interesting things here about these psychedelic compounds is how they kind of came in. There was a lot of interest. All sorts of political pressure kind of swept them under the rug, like Bob said, 40 years or so. And funding mechanisms aren't really there yet. You know, the highly scheduled status makes research kind of difficult. And these drugs aren't all that new. We've had them for so long. Luke, this is where we're going to kind of pivot to you and your expertise here. And how how should people try to understand this patent problem and why it's kind of been a hindrance to projects like the projects at Clusterbusters and perhaps even Maps Lycos?
Yeah. Yeah, before I try and answer that question, I'll just say that, I've really enjoyed reading the book. And I'm with you in saying that um, it's really helpful to understand one element of this sort of larger phenomenon of psychedelic resurgence. And I'll just say that it's really funny too at times. It's very serious and very important work, but also I think just a really fun read. And so um, kudos to you, Joanna, for doing it this way. Patenting is a big issue, a huge issue that has ramifications for this field for probably a long period of time. And I guess what we're talking about here is the above ground. We're talking about the medical model rather than other models of accessing the plant and fungi based psychoactive substances. So we're talking about this regulated model really, and um, patent law, which goes back hundreds of years, means that you can't. Right now, the way it's set up is that you can't patent naturally occurring substances, including certain plants out there, like the iboga plant is one that I suppose I would point towards. But um, this system, and there's lots of really excellent commentators here that I'd point everyone towards, David Casimir at Porta Sophia and Matt Zorn and Graham Pechnick. Shayla Love has done excellent work on this as well on patenting. Um, just if you're interested, check out them. But if we're talking about patentable psychedelic materials, what you really have to do is identify some sort of derivative or some sort of version of a plant or fungi material. And then as you're developing this process, you have to be able to say that it's new, that you're inventing something new, that it hasn't happened before that, before now. And I'm butchering this, Joe, but it's because I don't have a PhD in law. I have a PhD in history, and I guess the work that I have done with Porta Sophia as a historian, and the bulk of that work was a couple of years back, is trying to leverage historical knowledge and historical information and make that historical information available to the people who need to know, people who might push back against overly broad patents that we might call troubling or problematic. And so hopefully that sort of sketches for you, what the patent issue is.
Let me try to go a little further. So a lot of these molecules were patented quite a long time ago.
Mhm.
Usually a patent, when there's a new molecular use case, people say, oh yeah, cool, I'll throw millions at this to potentially bring it to market and make a lot more, right? Like Ozempic is the most, successful, most recent one. And because the molecules were so old, and there's politics in the way as well, people didn't have similar incentive to bring these things to market. And we hear this kind of tragic term to orphaned disease, like horrible. But it's like it's kind of just based on how, from my perspective, how there's just not economic incentive enough to make it happen, right? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, there have been some mechanisms to help, like the Orphan Drug Act. If maybe I'm not saying that correctly, but just as a way of incentivizing certain companies to get after pathologies, disease states that might not otherwise be explored by large pharmaceutical companies. So there have been some attempts in the legal system to get researchers to go after things like cluster headache. But companies that are trying to patent materials in this either fungi-based or plant-based substances in an overly broad way, and that's where groups come in like Porto Savia. I mean, it places pressure on the overall industry, and it does it in a few different ways. So the exclusivity that is given to a company for a patent essentially gives them a monopoly control, roughly 2 decades, and then if that IP is controlled by one entity, then what they can do is put barriers in place, sort of financial barriers in place that then prevents other groups from developing new drugs, new medicines. And again, just to say that we're talking about the medical model here, which is very different from personal use models, sacramental models, and people move between these models all the time. But within that medical model, overly broad patents are deeply, deeply problematic.
Thank you for that. I want to point the flashlight back at Harvard, Marsha, Bob. Back when you first got, the idea that you could work with Harvard, that had to be really enticing. And I'm really kind of curious, if, in retrospect, do you think you might have taken a different path today, knowing what you know now?
Well, I think from my perspective, I would have doled it out. I mean, if I would have said, okay, I'll give you this much when this is complete, then I'll dole out a little bit more. It was just too easy for them to piss it away as it was on various things. And then suddenly the money's gone and, well, guys, we need more. It was that kind of deal.
Yeah, it took us a while to start wising up and putting some milestones on the research. And the last milestone was never met. And, Halpern left money on the table because he didn't meet that milestone. And there was really no reason why he didn't. I still haven't had a good answer on why.
Which milestone was that?
Well, if you remember when we had our conference in Atlanta, we got word from the IRB at Harvard that they came back with 8 questions and concerns about our protocol and about approving the study. And we looked through it, and all 8 of their questions were easily answered or worked around or changed in the protocol. And so the next milestone at that point was turning in the response to the IRB to try to get it to be approved. And it would have been approved if we would have answered those 8 questions. And that response was never submitted by Halpern or Sewell, anybody. It was never submitted to the IRB. And that was kind of the end of it, as far as moving forward with that protocol that we had worked really hard on for a couple of years or whatever. So,
Well, personally, I thought, based on when I read the protocol that he submitted, that he had no intention of that getting accepted. I remember reading that protocol and I went through it and corrected spelling and said, well, this is, and I'm the patient, right? But I was like, it was a piece of crap what he submitted, the first one. So
yeah.
I don't think he had any intention of actually doing it. Just I thought maybe I don't remember, but I thought maybe he had gotten a certain amount of money if he just submitted it. And so that's what he just submitted this thing just to get that money. And then
that was the arrangement. So the first arrangement was that he really wanted your approval for funding for BOL 148 for that small clinical trial. And the board said, we will do it, but you must submit a protocol. And he did do that, but it was begrudging. And then the second time he submitted a protocol, it was in exchange for a small amount of money. At that point, he was at least I mean, I never saw his, his actual numbers, but according to emails that he was sending to you constantly and emails that you were receiving from Rick Doblin, he was he was out of salary. He had no more research funding left. And so he said he would do it. I mean, the language was quite desperate. And that was why he submitted it. And his reason for refusing, he had a couple different reasons for refusing to submit a revision. He said that the revision would have gone through, but as I recall, and I'll say this is my basic recollection, he didn't think it was worth it because there was no funding for a research study. He also thought, and this was an argument that went back and forth and all around between Rick Doblin, there was some input from a guy named Pedro Huertas, who was working in his lab, about whether you guys should really be pursuing BOL 148, which there was an argument that John was just sure that this was the far superior drug. And from the really consistently through this time, both you, Bob, and Marsha, the board was very consistent saying, we funded you with a very, very clear expectation of deliveries. We had deliverables in there, and the deliverable was an IRB protocol, a protocol submitted to the IRB that would be approved. And the response was always, oh, but we just have to do this. Oh, but we just have to do this. Oh, but we just have to do this. And what I saw, the dynamic there, and I think this isn't limited to the relationship between, in this case, but it's about equity in working with community groups. You guys went there, when you guys went there in 2006, what I saw was a lot of hope and optimism that you thought you were finding a real partner, people who you could trust, who were going to really, that you could count on to really explain this process to you, who really heard you, who really understood what your goals were, who really believed in this psychedelic protocol, and they were really going to kind of help walk you through this process. And you did have Bob, you had brought in, I'm sorry, I just forgot his name. You had brought in a friend who had a lot of experience creating protocols to help navigate this.
Jack Sandweiss.
Jack Sandweiss,
Yeah.
right? And I remember Rick didn't like him very much.
No.
Not liked him. But a lot of the time, when you guys were very clear saying, like, we funded this project A, and you keep coming and saying, no, we need project B, project C, project D. What you kept hearing was that you guys just didn't understand how academia worked. You needed to listen to them, because if you didn't listen to them, you were fools, basically, that you just didn't understand the process. And what I saw was a power differential playing out in a really problematic way. And in a way that I think even back in 2004, universities should have been more attuned to, because I can't think of, I just can't imagine somebody giving me a grant to do a project, and then me going back to them repeatedly and saying, actually, I had another project in mind. So I can't do this project, I have to do another project. And then when they say no, saying, yes, sorry, you just don't understand. Like that's just not a normal way to interact with a funder.
Yeah.
And so that felt to me like really a lot of power plays. And power plays, I mean, I think there is a lot of discussion in academia and, you know, in policy schools about and bioethics about what is the appropriate way to work with community organizations when they come to universities with funding. This is like a known place where you're going to see friction, and that I think was handled particularly poorly.
Well, I'll just make one brief comment on that with the BOL 148. So, personally, I think a real big part of why things changed to pushing BOL 148 rather than psilocybin was because there were 2 patents filed for BOL 148, and these people did not have any patents on psilocybin for cluster headaches. And not only did those 2 patents slow down by a couple of years future work on BOL 148, but they patented something that didn't have enough clinical data to interest other funders because it was such a small cohort of patients that were treated. So I think that was one of the big reasons why the BOL 148 was pushed over the psilocybin.
Who were some of the patent holders, Bob?
Well, Harvard and Andrew Sewell filed a patent. And, you know, Halpern was one of the inventors on the patent at Harvard. And Halpern was one of the inventors on BOL 148 for cluster headaches, along with a couple of other researchers. So yeah, I think patents came into play there with what happened to psilocybin versus BOL 148. And as Luke mentioned, these broad patents really hurt other research. I mean, there have been other treatments for cluster headache that were modified LSD molecules that were developed because there wasn't a patent on LSD, so methasergide could be developed and sold and was a treatment. And other headache treatments are also, you know, taken from the basic molecule of different psychedelics. So when you try to broadly patent a psychedelic, you're also patenting and stopping all of the research that finds, you know, other analogs.
So, and I also think one of the other big factors in slowing down this psilocybin research at Harvard was Halpern had started a business with BOL, had started a company. So he was gonna, if all went well, he had this get rich scheme going on, and he thought we should all just, you know, here's BOL, you guys should just do that. And I kept trying to tell him, I said, no, my money was supposed to go to psilocybin. It's a psilocybin research that people aren't going to be able to go out and pick BOL in their yard and have it, you know, help with their headaches. And this was the whole reason why I wanted psilocybin, was so that people could benefit from it right away. And they were looking at, you know, well, at that point they said probably 10 years to develop it. And they thought that one pill would cost a patient $600 based on the research and all that. So I was like, that makes a lot of sense.
So Luke, I have a question. Bob was originally listed as an author on one of these research papers and was later removed. Does this happen often, or what do you think happened here?
So it seems pretty bizarre, actually. It seems pretty strange from an outsider's perspective. That that Bob's name would be removed from any publications. So non-academic and community partners should be included within the list of authors for all papers, unless there's some other sort of extenuating circumstances. And it's normal to include, and actually it's preferred now if you're doing community-based work, to have authors part of the long list. So it was a little strange, having to read that and not knowing much about it. It's just the norm that you're going to acknowledge the expertise, you're going to acknowledge the efforts and perspectives of all the participants of basically a research output being a research paper. So long story short, from my perspective, it was a little bit weird.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's strange things afoot. And Luke, I can relate to this, as one of my friends has recently kind of been in a similar quagmire. And it's interesting, right? Because we want to see the science progress, but we're not getting the salary, right?
So there's an
I think
ethical way, right? Like there's an ethical way of doing this. If basically if there's going to be, sorry to interrupt, by the way, but if someone is going to be removed from a paper, there is sort of a normal way or almost a protocol for this to happen. So there has to be discussion between the individuals involved in the research. Essentially, there has to be some sort of documentation involved with a particular researcher being removed from the list of authors. Usually a journal is going to inquire, so there's like specific journal policies around this. So again, Joe, I didn't mean to interrupt you there, but I just wanted to reaffirm that I thought it was a little bit bizarre.
Yeah, it's
There's
fascinating.
also a number of rationales that were consistently given to you, Bob, about why you couldn't be an author. Again, I can't remember what they are off the top of my head if you want to pipe in, but I just want to point out that in 2006, Bob Jesse was a co-author on that Roland Griffiths paper about psychedelics. And, he doesn't have a PhD, and I don't know what he was doing I'm sure that he was part of the product, I'm not going to questioning his role, but sometimes I think like, okay, well, is this like an anachronism that I'm, imparting, but I was a researcher, I was in university research at that time, and I have a pretty solid understanding of how IRBs were working, and how authorship was working, but I can also look at psychedelic research from that year and see it operating in different ways. So it was a little strange. And again, like I think there was a reason I wanted to talk about it, which is not just for the specific point of view of Clusterbusters, although I was very concerned about that, but because of, I think, what I saw as this, again, like as you mentioned, Joe, like the science from nowhere view, like if it seems like it might cause a problem, we're going to have to erase it. And seeing now how that can bubble up, in a regulatory process, it's interesting. Like, I think I'm a fan of transparency anyway. I like giving people credit for what they've done. So it was really kind of peculiar to kind of read through how this was happening. I think you see a lot of politicking there, all through these years. You get to see how Rick Doblin, with the whole the political science that he does. Luke and I both come from a science studies background where we know that science is political, and that I don't think Rick would have gone as far as he did if he didn't understand that in order to get science to move forward, you really do need to pull together a network of allies, people who are on board with your project. And that means sometimes people, group projects and people will get dropped. You can really see that there's kind of machinations happening here, and you can see how Clusterbusters, who've been working on psychedelics for pain and psychedelics for headache for so long, fall out of that network. There's something. They're not moving the work forward in a way that suits this other mission. And when they are useful, they get incorporated into this network, and then when it's not useful anymore, they get drops. There are only so many resources to go around.
Yeah. So just a couple things on this. So I was never really one that was that worried about getting any word on anything for my work that was being done, any recognition for that. What really did always bother me was that Clusterbusters as a community didn't get the recognition that they deserve, because there were so many people doing so much work. So I was really hurt a lot more when Clusterbusters wouldn't get any recognition. The only reason that I ever remember being told about being removed from some of these papers was that because Clusterbusters was funding the work, that it would look really bad if I was one of the co-authors of any of this work, of this research that was being put out there. And knowing how political all of this was and was becoming, I just kind of took that as a acceptable answer and said, whatever, but I'm not going to pay for other authors to be added that isn't going to be doing any work just so that they can be added. I'm not paying for their name to be put on this work, which really ticked me off, when you compare that to all of the work that was being done by so many others that weren't ending up on the paper. So
yeah, I thought science was objective. I was misled.
yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
we're starting to get some questions from the audience. If it's okay to transition now. So first one here is, how often do patient advocacy organizations partner with large universities or pharma on developing drugs?
I only know
Anybody
of
want to
one,
take
so.
Oh, anybody else know of another besides Clusterbusters? I don't.
Well, sure. I mean, I think, as Luke mentioned, like, this community-based research is a big thing now. Like, lots and lots of people are, researchers are really encouraged to do this kind of work now. On the flip side, citizen science projects and patient-led research is also being encouraged. Citizen science can mean a lot of things, right? It can mean that scientists are doing more of the leading and then bringing in these groups to do something more like, we have PCORI, patient-centered outcomes research, right? Where you bring in patients to kind of just get their opinions. But you can also look at like long COVID, for example. Like, the long COVID groups are doing amazing work, really driving innovation, bringing that work straight into universities. Patients have a lot of education. They can do this work themselves. And I know groups like the government organizations like the NSF is really interested in how to use DIY bio and these kinds of innovative spaces, trying to capture the speed at which citizen scientists can operate, and trying to figure out how to do that in a safer way. So it's not just that it's encouraged. Like, I mean, there's a way to look at this as like, we should be doing more of this and trying to figure out how to do it better.
I would agree.
It really can amplify science spent. Luke?
Yeah, thanks. I guess I would totally agree with what Joanna's saying, and just a word of caution on this one, because there is the potential, and some historical literature shows that some community-based groups have been co-opted, and their work has been taken and reshaped for the purposes maybe not that they had thought. So the recent opioid crisis is an example, thinking about how different pharmaceutical companies that were manufacturing opioids worked with community groups to change the ways in which um, pain pills were prescribed to people. And so you began to see that community groups were actually underpinning research that basically helped doctors and pharmaceutical companies get more pain medicine out to people, which has then sort of had downstream effects of, what we have now. So just a word of caution about how community groups can work effectively and may need to just have their antennae up about this.
Right. Yeah, I just finished reading Empire of Pain, and very, very helpful in that regard, understanding that story. Joanna, there's a story, question coming in for you here. How would you like to see this book change the current situation? And are the pitfalls you found in what Clusterbusters encountered still happening today?
Yeah, so a couple things. First, I would like very much to restore some credit and authorship to Clusterbusters. I'd like people to that was just simply ignored and dropped out for a couple decades now, and see a lot more, quite a lot more attention paid to that, and I would like to see people treat the kind of community underground work with more respect. With again, I think there are other cautions there as well. With data triangulation is a wonderful thing. We don't have to accept any, I mean, this is just one source of information, but it's a good one, and we should be giving people credit. I would like to also say that Dr. Schindler, who has been funded largely with the help of Carrie Turnbull, Ceruvia Hefter Research Institute, has been incredible at doing this work really well, and in partnership with Marsha, with Clusterbusters, and is very transparent and doesn't seem to have been holding her back at all. He has, I think, sorted through some of these patent issues as well. So yeah, I think I answered that question. Thanks.
So. And Bob, this should be a quick one for you. Ethan Russo asks if there have been any psychedelic companies that have approached CB about a study with psilocybe cubensis mushrooms as opposed to synthetic psilocybin.
Not yet. There are companies out there that are doing psychedelic research for cluster headaches with several different molecules. Everything that I've seen so far is with psilocybin is with synthetic, because that's what really fits the medical model for clinical trials, where it can be accurately measured. Each dose can be exact, so it's much easier. But I think it's a great question, because we never knew for sure, and still don't know, whether the entire mushroom, which contains more than just psilocybin, has a better beneficial effect. There's a lot of work going on about stacking different types of mushrooms and different types of things like that provide really good results in ways that just one of them doesn't. So I would love to have a study done with the whole mushroom, just to see if there was any difference.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Bob. I want to thank all the panelists here for joining. Obviously, there's so much work left to do. Thank you all for watching and joining us here and adding in some questions. There's just, yeah, so much left to uncover here around psychedelics on account of the drug war, and hopefully research funding will become available in time from the federal government, and hopefully maybe we can find ways to make this research more efficient, perhaps descheduling psychedelics for some research cases, for instance. And yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Joe Moore, for leading this conversation. Thank you, our panelists. Next week will be our final session of this series. We're going to have Dr. Schindler, who's leading the research out of Yale that's been so great in moving things forward from a randomized clinical trial perspective. We're going to have Dr. Joel Castellanos, who's out at UC San Diego, who's really one of the leading voices in the broader topic of psychedelics for pain. We're going to have Ken Maxwell, who is an individual living with cluster headache. He participated in the Yale trial, and he's a leading advocate at the state level trying to get policies expanded to allow access. And we'll have Carrie Turnbull, who has taken control of some of those patents that are for Bull 148. He's been funding some of this psilocybin research, and it will be very interesting to hear his perspective at the back end of this story, getting to where we are now. And it goes much longer. Joanna, do you have anything you want to say to be the last word?
No, but thank you guys for all coming and all your support. And thank you especially to Joe. You're doing such great work in this area, and I'm sure everybody really appreciates it. I know I do.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Yep.